what shapes him, what defines him as a political writer, is the Spanish Civil War, in which he goes to fight one of the great evils of the last century, fascism, supposedly with the communists on his side, and discovers that the communists, under Stalin's orders, are shooting other people who are fighting the fascists, including the people he's fighting with. And in one moment, he therefore discovers the two great totalitarian evils of the 20th century, fascism and communism at one and the same time. And this is an absolutely defining moment in Orwell's life, so he's identified the three great evils of the 20th century: imperialism, fascism, and communism. Got it in one. By the late 1930s, he's also worked out how to write that extraordinary style of political writing, which he described as being trying to make political writing into an art, that pellucid, deceptively plain prose. He gets sick, but before he dies, as well as the fantastic essays, he writes the two great masterpieces, the defining masterpieces, 1984 and Animal Farm. Truly the defining parables of the totalitarian experience in the 20th century. And then, ladies and gentlemen, his last literary masterstroke. He dies. Young. Now, this may not sound to you necessarily a good idea, but actually, for a political writer, write their two greatest masterpieces at just the right moment in history, and then to die, is a great career move. Because then all your friends, or so-called friends, can mythologize you without having the awkwardness of your still being around to be one of their rivals. Your work can continue to resonate, to be embraced by left and right and center, which is exactly, as you know, what has happened to Orwell ever since. And he's not around to contradict them. And then there's an endless parlor game, which is, you know, what would Orwell have been if he'd turned 60, 70, 80? There was a particularly ludicrous piece, I'm ashamed to say, in The Guardian the other day, which said that he would have become a kind of right-wing food writer. A sort of Nigella Lawson in tweeds. Well, I'm sorry, this is an absolute fool's game. What we have is a great work, and the work speaks for itself, and it speaks first of all about the really deep, deep character of totalitarianism, of dictatorship, of oppression, violent oppression altogether. And that brings me to my second Orwell. The Orwell who was relevant to the Myanmar which I visited in the year 2000, at a time when most of the Orwellian regimes in the world, like the Soviet Union, had actually crumbled. Orwellian, of course, in the negative sense. But Myanmar, one has to say, was still holding out as a truly Orwellian country, run by something which had initially been called SLORC, which sounds like something out of Tolkien, and has then renamed itself the State Peace and Development Council, SPDC, itself a wonderful Orwellian euphemism, by the way, the Peace and Development Council. And I want us to single out three elements of the Orwellian analysis which seem to be particularly illuminating in relation to that totalitarian state from which this country has only recently emerged. Number one, the Orwellian analysis of the central importance to oppression of all kinds, of language, of the manipulation of language by what he called, remember, the Ministry of Truth in 1984, which is all about producing lies, newspeak, a language in which certain thoughts could not be thought because the words did not exist for them, the memory hole down which certain events disappeared, and propaganda slogans like 2 + 2 = 5, which, by the way, actually was a Soviet propaganda slogan. Now, this is exactly what I discovered in Myanmar. For example, when I went to the museum of the Tatmadaw, the Burmese Army, there was a brief history of the Myanmar Army, a deathless classic, which I still have on my shelves, which managed to write the history of Myanmar without mentioning at all the 1990 elections, in which, of course, the NLD scored a landslide victory. It had just gone down the memory hole, right? But what it did say was that the army was essential to present the kind of anarchy, I quote, which destroyed the former Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Indonesia. There was also, I mentioned this in an earlier session, that amazing newspaper, The New Light of Myanmar, which, as I said in an earlier session, makes Izvestia looks like The Guardian on a good day, which had the most wonderful, instead of sort of Leonid Brezhnev visiting a tractor factory, it had Secretary 1, or Secretary 2, or Secretary 3, because they were numbered secretaries, visiting a school or hospital or a pagoda, a temple. I wrote down one visit to a temple. I quote, "In conclusion, the Secretary 1 expressed his wishes, quote, 'May I be able to attain nirvana due to merits gained for building and donating the center.'" Well, it's not up to me to answer that question, but I'm not sure that quite did the business. But the New Light of Myanmar at the same time was writing about how we had to crush all internal and external destructive elements as a common enemy. It referred to Aung San Suu Kyi as being, I quote, "obsessed by lust and superstition." Lust and superstition. And this is a particular favorite, I quote, "swinging around a bamboo pole brushed with cess." Swinging around a bamboo pole brushed with cess, as in cesspit, which sounds to me a pretty impressive sort of Olympic sport, I must say. But is also, of course, very, very nasty stuff indeed. So there you had the Orwellian organ, The New Light of Myanmar. Number 2, those of you who've read your Orwell will remember Room 101 in 1984. Room 101 was a torture room where everyone would be confronted with the one thing they could not bear, right? Their particular horror. For George Orwell, it was actually rats. If you look at his letters, he had a particular obsession and fear of rats. And so in the book, it's actually rats he's faced with. Room 101, by the way, historically, was a room in the headquarters of the BBC External Services, where Orwell had to sit through a lot of very long, very boring committee meetings. So it was a little Orwellian joke to make Room 101 the torture chamber. But of course, in this country, in the period after 1962, you had many, many Room 101s. You had extreme brutality, torture, violence, by which the regime maintained its power. And that is the second Orwellian insight, which I think is particularly relevant to the history of Myanmar past, which is that it's a partnership of lies and violence, of words and sticks with which you beat people, that keep such regimes in power.